Hi, everyone, and welcome to Perfect Prey, a Coercive Control podcast. I'm glad you're here. My name is Dr. Christine Marie Cocchiola, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have a doctorate in clinical social welfare, where I researched coercive control and the impact on both adult and child victims. Most importantly, I am a survivor and a protective parent. Victims and survivors of coercive control are never to blame, but I chose the name Perfect Prey because coercive controller, narcissistic abusers are individuals who seem to have characterologically disordered personalities, and they do choose who to prey upon. They choose people who tend to be agreeable and conscientious, perhaps loyal to a fault, fixers, optimistic, and empathic. And these coercive controllers prey upon those who are most vulnerable, including our children. It's part of their plan to gain control. How do we help our children when they are experiencing systematic, unacknowledged child abuse? We need to understand how these coercive controllers, harmful individuals, predatory parents attempt to exert their power over us and our children. We need to look beyond a trauma-informed lens, but also layer it with a coercive control lens. So, let's engage in personal power conversations that will create the protective parts that will derail the coercive controller from their plan. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to Perfect Prey. To remind you, please remember to subscribe and to share this podcast with other people. As you know, I really want to elevate the conversation around coercive control and the experiences of victims and survivors. And the reason why I call the podcast Perfect Prey is because I think abusers seek us out. And I am really honored today to have here my friend and colleague, Laura Richards, crime analyst, who is going to talk about coercive control. And Laura, I would love for you to introduce yourself, but I really also don't want to forget to ask you to please frame how you discuss these relationships, because I can see people out there shifting the way they talk about, instead of saying, I was in an abusive relationship. We can come back to that, but I really love the way that you do that. It empowers victims and survivors. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a real privilege and honor. And yes, my name's Laura Richards. I'm a criminal behavioral analyst. I studied and have a master's in forensic and legal psychology, and I worked at New Scotland Yard for 10 years running their sexual offences section, their homicide prevention unit, which I set up, and also their violent crime intelligence and analysis unit. And I'm still recovering from that. It was a big chunk of my life, but I reviewed many, many cases, predominantly of women being murdered by men. And that's really where I started asking questions about what's going on. Can we create some kind of risk checklist to prevent the escalation of cases? And that's where the DASH came from, the domestic abuse, stalking and harassment and honor-based violence risk model. I set up Paladin, the National Stalking Advocacy Service, having changed the law on stalking in 2011 and 2012. And then I decided to tackle the big elephant in the room, which was domestic violence and coercive control. And that law reform campaign actually took 1 year. It was the shortest and most successful campaign in Parliament, where we showed overwhelming and compelling evidence that the law needed to be modernized and catch up with women and children's lived experience of abuse. And I'm very proud of those law reform campaigns, the Stalking and Coercive Control Law Reform Campaign. And I've been helping change laws across the world, in Australia and America, as you well know. And I'm author of the book Policing Domestic Violence and host of the podcast Crime Analyst and Real Crime Profile. So that's a very long introduction.
But a very important one. And what I really want people to hear is this idea that you shifted legislation significantly in the UK and all of the work that you did, and then you brought it here to the United States. I was one of the testifiers with you for Jennifer's Law here in the state of Connecticut, and it was because of your voice and so many. I actually quote you oftentimes that coercive control is a war of attrition, right? And how harmful it is to all of us when we lose our agency. And your powerful testimony for Jennifer's Law, I'm sure, is part of what propelled it to actually move forward as quickly as it did. So you obviously
are a mover and a shaker because somehow or another, when you step into these spaces, shifts do occur. And I'm so appreciative of that, really.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I like to think that I bring a million voices into the room with me because I'm always talking about real life experiences and victims and survivors, and it's their voices that were absolutely fundamental in shifting opinions in England and Wales that the law needed to be changed. In fact, when we surveyed victims and survivors, we found that 98% of them said that coercive control was the worst thing, that the physical, yes, the bruises and the bones, they mended and faded, but they said the psychological, the emotional, the entrapment, how they got caught in a trap, that was the worst thing. And so when I go into rooms, I think it's really important that we hear from children, we hear from victims. Some of them aren't survivors as yet, they're still going through it, but that tends to move the needle. And then we can use the data and look at the murders as well and really start to unravel. I call them murders in slow motion and now suicides in slow motion because the patterns are the same. So I started showing people those patterns. And you'll remember in the Connecticut testimonies, I testified with Jennifer Magnano's children, and that was incredibly powerful. And in fact, after that session, there were a number of Republican senators who wanted to talk to me, and I talked to them. They were intrigued by the fact I was former law enforcement, and I was saying that we should be criminalizing, and they were very intrigued by that. And I still believe 100% we should be codifying and criminalizing coercive control in all countries. That yes, we've got it in family law acts, and that's a good first step forward in California, in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, and now finally in South Carolina, coercive control law is on the books for it to be criminalized. And I hope this time in Micah Francis's name that happens, because it is desperately and urgently needed.
No, what you're talking about, right, is that we have to have, sadly, a death. That's what happened in Connecticut, right? We had these numerous deaths in order to actually propel the legislation. But I appreciate that. And I'm going back to when we first met, which is at the Conference on Crimes Against Women, where you were speaking specifically. And I think wasn't one of the Mignano children was presenting with you, right? Because this idea that how impacted children are, and people seem to forget that. And then we seem to forget victims and survivors. One of the things that I think you do a really wonderful job with, and I have a hard time with this, is when we get people saying, well, men are victims too. And, why don't you talk about men and their experiences? And I would love for you to speak about that because I think we feel similarly, but it's a challenge. I think it's an uphill climb.
Yes, well, from having spoken to many, many survivors, what's interesting is there's this one conversation I had with a female firefighter, and she said to me, when we attend a fire, Laura, and let's say it's the middle terrace house and there are other houses around it, but the middle terrace house is on fire, we focus on that house first. And that's what I say about this emergency regarding women. It's women predominantly being abused, harmed, raped, and murdered by men. And therefore, we have to focus on that first and foremost. And in England and Wales, we know through the Home Office data and from all the data count that I did, that we know that 93% of the cases, we are talking about women being abused by men. And that's why I tend to codify by saying, I'm going to talk predominantly about a female victim being abused by a male, but I accept that there are male victims too. And often it's men being harmed by other men. Exactly. So we're not saying that we totally exclude, but we have to look at what the emergency is. And we know that femicide is at an all-time high all around the world. And that's what we must focus on as a national and international emergency.
Agreed. I think when we think about the most vulnerable populations, I just did a TEDx and I used the example of breast cancer impacts everyone. But really, who does it impact the most? And why do we focus mostly on a pink ribbon campaign, et cetera? Because if we don't actually support the people who are suffering it the most and do the research around that, then how can we help everyone else, right? And so it's just really, people become very frustrated when they think that you're only trying to support women. That's not at all the case. When we're really trying to support everyone, but you can't help everyone until you help the most vulnerable. That's the bottom line.
Absolutely. And you have to look at the nuance. And nuance is so important, particularly when we're talking about risk assessment. And in the DASH risk model, over half the questions talk to coercive control, and it is very nuanced and idiosyncratic. And when we look at structured inequalities, so we know that there's a gender bias, a sex bias against women. We know that women are oppressed. We know that that's what keeps the victim, if she's female, entrapped, patriarchy. And we know that the legal systems, criminal, family, and civil, historically codify male authority. And that's why oftentimes, as I kept seeing at New Scotland Yard, what was really intriguing to me is why, when women were coming forward, why weren't they being believed? And there is a bias against women. There is a disbelief when victims come forward. And there is a sense from male perpetrators, they are entitled, they do feel privileged. And that's reinforced when his account is believed. And yet she needs 25 pieces of evidence, 10 witnesses to corroborate what's gone on. And look, I'm not saying that you just believe people without investigating. I've always said that you have to investigate, but if you don't believe someone, you don't investigate. And that's what I kept seeing happening over and over and over again. So I'm not just saying generically believe all women. I'm saying start from the position of being open-minded and investigate before you make that determination. And that first step wasn't happening in many of the cases that I reviewed when women were coming forward, sometimes 33 times, reporting horrific abuse, and they just weren't being believed. And then when she's dead, oh, we believe her. And then we do a review, because I started the domestic homicide review process in the UK as well, put that into a statutory framework in 2004, working with Harriet Harman. We would then review the murder, and we kept seeing these patterns that she told us he was going to kill her, and then he did. And when you track it back, it all comes down to not believing a woman when she comes forward. And that's what I've been trying to change. Why would we start from a position of not believing? And that does come down to patriarchy and all the tropes, the misogyny, the patriarchy that makes us question women all the time. What she did, what she said, what she wore, rather than focusing on his behavior. And too often I see that he's just believed out of hand just when he says something. And that's what I've really been trying to change. But we have to create laws to effectively represent what women's and children's experiences are of male violence, and the psychological, the emotional, the entrapment of how she gets stuck in that spider's web.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to share with you my protective parenting program. I hear from parents all the time that it's a game changer for them. It's really about creating opportunities for you to be almost like a therapist in the home for your child who is suffering coercive control. Lots of you know I wrote the book, Every Moment of Every Day. It's a children's book to help children and protective parents as they navigate these situations where they're feeling overwhelmed and dysregulated. Beyond that, we need to be helping our children to understand what their body is telling them, and also really looking through a coercive control lens at their experiences. It's time that we really understand that children are experiencing the same exact trauma that we experienced. How do we parent them differently? Our children are different as a result of this experience they've had, and we are different. And we have to truly look through the coercive control lens to support them. I hope you will join me in the Protective Parenting Program. It's offered live and self-study. And of course, I always hope that if there's anything I can do or any of my team members can do to support you, that you reach out.
Absolutely. You make me think about also that, like, feminist psychologists in the early 70s, when they did research and they called this intimate terrorism, they would say that the worst part was not the physical violence. The worst part was the fear of what would come next. And so, and then you're actually, I love what you just said. You said, if you don't believe someone, we tend to not investigate. Like, why aren't we treating everything on the same playing field? I always say that a victim can do 9 egregious things for a female victim can do 9 egregious things for every male's 1 egregious out of 10. and she's held to a much higher standard. And we have research in the family court world over and over again, Saunders, various researchers that have found that there is a hierarchy in the family court system. And that hierarchy believes that judges have more power than anyone else, and that they do. I mean, it's since 1607, judges have judicial immunity. They are basically able to make any decisions and not be held to account as long as they're in their jurisdiction. It's like there's two things, and it's like so silly, because what it does is it gives them carte blanche to make decisions regardless of evidence or without evidence, to your point, I think, right? Yeah.
Yes, and you always need evidence. But the problem is, if you're not professionally curious and if you just dismiss somebody out of hand, you just don't believe them. And that's what I kept seeing every time I reviewed the murders. And I kept scratching my head about, well, why was she not believed? Because there was corroborating evidence. There was information to show that what she was saying was a truthful account. And that is something, even when I train, I'm always talking to professionals about professional curiosity, to ask questions and not just dismiss someone, but often it's subconscious. It's something that we do. That little voice in our head judges her far more harshly than it does him. So when changing the law on coercive control, I really wanted people to understand that it is a pattern of behavior. And all of our language talks against that when people talk about the incident. I attended the incident, said the police officer. And the minute they use that word, it denotes a one-off rather than a pattern. So that was the first starting point. Like when we changed the law on stalking, I was very clear with the Home Office lawyers, it's patterned behaviour. You have to look for that historical pattern. And of course, in family courts, there's often someone saying the pattern, the history is irrelevant. Well, it's absolutely is relevant. Past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour. And as a criminal behavioural analyst, I will stand by that. And I do not know why that has not translated to the family court, because it means that the risk assessments are flawed. And being an expert on risk assessment, I'm very clear. If he is a risk to mum, he's a risk to the child. If he's a risk to the child, he's a risk to mum. And so we have to have these, it's like a 0.0 to start. And that's what we did with coercive control, making it clear it's a pattern of behavior used to control, exploit, isolate, dominate, subordinate, and entrap. And it's that entrapment part that I believe, where we are in 2025, most people still don't understand that, or the power imbalance, that the first thing you do is look to see whether there's a power imbalance. And like with Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, it was very clear who held power right from the start. He was stopping her from going into her van. He took her keys, he took her phone, he took her backpack. And he told her he was going to leave her there. And 2 male witnesses told the police that. And yet they couldn't understand why Gabby was desperate to get into the van. She was dysregulated, upset. Brian held power. No one questioned that because of patriarchy. Patriarchy normalizes this stuff. That people don't question it. And that's why it was important to change the law on coercive control, that the abusers will use physical and or psychological, emotional, financial, sexual. They will use all these tactics to keep her entrapped. They will use threats and intimidation towards the people she cares about the most, her children, her pets, her mother, her father, whoever she cares about the most, they will be threatened too. And he will manipulate to make sure his needs are met above all else. And that's why it's so important to define coercive control, because I think even present day, the CDC do not have the correct definition. I'm seeing various lifts out of England and Wales's law, just a paragraph of charities and NGOs putting it on their website, and it is not the accurate definition. And I know you know this, but it's one of my pet peeves and frustrations right now.
Huge.
When I hear people say, 1 in 2 men experience coercive control. No, they do not. It is just not possible. They're using the wrong definition. And it's not just about the relationship, it's about the macro picture, the big picture, the grooming, the manipulation, patriarchy, misogyny that play a part in keeping her entrapped within this horrific situation that sometimes before the law change, she didn't have the words to describe it. And now we've given the words, we've given the legal framework. And I desperately want laws to change all over the world so that it's codified in criminal law, so that there's that language, that framework, and there's early identification, intervention, and prevention before the escalation to murder.
Absolutely. It's structurally and it's structurally endemic. It is literally embedded in our systems and the systems we all rely on for protection, which is something that people don't actually realize. And I think knowing that there are many people in the system who are truly aligned with that ideology also, right? Going back to women lying, like the Bala study says that mothers lie less than 2% of the time. And again, to your point, and it's something I talk very often about when I think about Gabby Petito and other, sadly, infamous cases where someone has been perpetrated upon, you think about the parental subsystem or the relationship subsystem, I call it. Like, what was the dynamics, what had been the dynamics all along, but they were more covert. They weren't as evident to everybody because there also was the loving experiences that the victim was having. And I think that that's what people think. Sometimes people think coercive control has to be extreme. Like it has to be like so overt. And the reality is there are so many nuances to it. And it can be a place where a victim actually feels love. That's why, why don't victims leave? Well, because there is this pulling in, because there are good moments. And so victims hold on to those good moments. And so we're often saying, well, if it was that bad, why didn't she leave? Well, because she didn't know it was that bad. And if she, the reality is that if she didn't know and the world doesn't know, who's going to tell her? I often say, we have interventions for substance use offense. Like somebody has a substance use addiction, you have like the TV show Intervention, right? People have interventions for them. The reality is it would be really great to have interventions for victims and survivors, like literally a loving group of people to come around. And then guess what, Laura? She leaves. And that's when she's most at risk. So we're supposed to have an intervention to take away the toxicity of whatever this relationship dynamic is, right? Abusive, right? But then how do we get her out? How do we get her out? How do we keep her safe? We don't. I mean, that's the problem, right? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and it's very conflicting for a victim because she might be told that you have to leave for the sake of your children. And when she does, then she's at heightened risk. And then you have a family court process that he may instigate and weaponize the courts. And then she's told you have to give him access for the sake of the children. And I have had victims say to me, which one is it, Laura? I should be leaving for the sake of the children, or now I'm going through family court for the sake of the children. It conflicts and it makes no sense. And the family courts, as you know, having written the book Framed, which we've talked about, it's a great book where it exposes what goes on in family court, where it is state-sanctioned abuse. Nowhere else would you say we're going to give a child to an abuser. Nowhere else would that make sense that he's convicted for rape, he's a paedophile, but in family courts, let's still give him access to his children. Let's not take away parental responsibility. That is absolutely mind-blowing to me as somebody who is an expert in risk assessment. We know that at the point of separation, 76% of women are murdered by men. That is nuanced. It is about women being murdered by men. It's not about people being killed at the point of separation.
Thank you.
It's a male behavior towards women because he says, if I can't have you, no one can. And if you want to play games with me, and if you do this, then this will happen. This is all about coercive control of keeping her, knowing her place and entrapped. And it's about possession and ownership. And it's very rare to have a woman say similar things. I own you. And if you try and leave me, I will kill you. And that's everything about patriarchy. So with risk assessment, she's in a very difficult position because often she stays because she knows it's too risky to leave, that she puts herself and children at risk because when she goes, that post-separation abuse and stalking intensifies. And that's what I call the war of attrition, where she just cannot win. And then she has a police officer and other professionals telling her what she should do without understanding the full 360 of the risk and danger that she is in. And when we use language like abusive relationship, tumultuous relationship, volatile relationship, what that person is saying is it's half a dozen of one, half a dozen of the other, i.e. it's mutual. And she knows that you don't understand what she's experiencing at his hands when you use those phrases. But that's the hangover from patriarchy. It's in all of us, the misogyny and the hangover from patriarchy, because we've all been brought up in it. And it's the same old when we hear every day, you have to massage his ego, but we say about her, she's got too big for her boots. We need to take her down a peg. And so there's this understanding that men can be and do whatever they want, but she has to follow this rigid gender role and set of rules that we all learned somewhere along the line. No one sat us down and told us these things, but we've osmosed it through music, through our own experiences when we walk into a room with a male presenter and he's introduced and we, the woman, are not. So we're told that he's valuable, we're not. And it's these 1,000 cuts that women experience every day. And isn't it ironic that it's not women killing men at the same rates, but it's often about the fragility of male ego as to why he takes a choice to kill her when he can't have her. Right. That is the fragility of male ego. That's not about mental health or any form of crisis. That is about male entitlement and male privilege.
Hi, everyone. Are you seeking enhanced knowledge and a certification supporting victims, survivors of coercive control? Do you acknowledge that all too often the systems are failing to do this, and most importantly, failing to prioritize the physical and psychological safety of children? Maybe you are a court professional, an attorney, a guardian ad litem, a custody evaluator, an advocate. Whatever work you are doing, if you are a therapist, we need a sea of allies. Right now, this training offers 12 CEs for anybody who completes it, and also it has reciprocity to other mental health professional certifications. I do hope you'll join me. I offer it live periodically throughout the year, at least several times, and also offer it self-study. Again, I hope to see you there. We need a sea of allies.
I love the way you just said that, because people do sometimes say, oh, well, maybe he has a mental health issue or he suffered trauma. And, I think that it's what you're pointing to is so important, because why do we make people co-parent with someone who is an abuser? Why do we make children have to be with that person? Because when we talk about all the amounts of money that are spent in mental health in general, I kind of dwindle it down to this idea that children are growing up in unsafe homes. And if I grow up in an unsafe home, my chances of either being in an abusive relationship are greater, or my chances of behaving more like an abuser are greater. It's not black and white. It's not both of them. There's nuances in there, and I want everyone listening to understand that. But there is so much money that could be saved if we protected children. If we just protected children. And then that means protecting mothers most of the time. To your point, most of the time, mothers, women in general, don't have the same amount of power in society to exert coercive control in the same way, period. It's just, I have clients who are gay, who are with other women, right? Okay. And they have had these experiences, but the level of ability for a man to exert power and control is just, it's part and parcel of being a man. It's just,
it is. It's normalized, as is, male entitlement and male privilege. It is just normalized in upbringings. And I agree with you, the children who are being put further at risk, further at harm. Yes, we often see through the meta-analysis, and I know through lots of my cases, some will go on to repeat the patterns of behavior that they see from dad, and they see that that works. And so they just repeat it until they're held to account. Some of them will learn helplessness in inverted commas, and they will make poor choices because of what they've been subjected to. And others may go on to thrive with an intervention. But the children have, as you always talk about, they are the invisible victims here, and it's the next generation that suffers. And I tear my hair out, having just spoken to Dr. Charlotte Proudman about her cases and her book, He Said, She Said, where there are so many case studies in there, much like Framed, showing how women are continually disbelieved and told not to talk about the abuse because their children will be taken from them. And they're caught in this catch-22. And children are harmed in that process. And if you're harming the mother, you're harming the child. And often those family courts are weaponized. And what I see through my work is there's no one who fights harder than a dad who never changed a diaper in family court. And that is very true. Every case where I ask the mum, well, tell me about the children when they were born, tell me about the pregnancy, tell me about what he did in terms of the share, carrying that load. And they're often invisible in that. And some of them even see it as them doing childcare to their own children. And yet there they are in family court trying to get a residence order. And this is just, as you know, generic. It's in Australia, it's in the UK, it's in America. We're not talking about one particular place or country. And that's what people really need to understand, because I think when women are in the family courts, they're desperate to protect their child or children. That's why they're there. But often when men are in the family court, they're there to punish the mother. And when you punish the mother, you punish the children. And I know that through my own upbringing. And that is the very unhealthy dynamic where if we had accountability from men, if there were men who said to their friends, you know what, you treat your wife or your ex-wife really badly and you're not paying the money that you should for your children, I don't want to hang around with you. You're not my kind of person. Sort that out. If you had men holding others to account, and that's what we mean when we talk about accountability. But I am really sick to the back teeth of the not all men brigade who appear on social media. And, it's a very low bar when they say, well, I don't abuse women, and they think that that's okay just to say, well, I don't abuse women, therefore I'm not interested in the conversation. It's about how we all hold others to account, particularly when there's abuse of children and when there's abuse of women.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have a big fight, I think, in front of us, because it does take, I think, both men and women and anyone who's interested. I mean, we need more people engaged in this process to support this particular issue. What people don't realize is this issue is literally, from a clinical perspective, I see it as the underlying problem of many societal problems. Like, it's the underlying issue that's impacting so many people throughout the lifespan. It's actually preventable. We could actually prevent the intergenerational trauma, but we're not talking about it. And we have judges and lawyers who don't understand child psychology at all. And we have judges and lawyers who don't understand the pathology of abusers, which I know you are trying to really elevate that conversation. I'm so grateful you were here today to talk about this. I think we could probably talk for an hour. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate all that you do to elevate this conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate all that you do as well. And I would concur that coercive control and domestic abuse is the underbelly of most problems that exist in the world. And if we start there, that would be massively transformational. And having children growing up in a healthy home where there are one parent or two parents that are healthy and wholehearted, and hand that down, because children will mirror and they will do what we do, not what we say. They will follow our patterns of behavior. So the next generation, if we're unhealthy and not wholehearted and we've been abused and we've not taken responsibility for our choices in the future, that's when we see that continuation of the harm. And it is very damaging for children, as you well know, on a psychosocial development basis, but also brain development. We see both in the neuroscience and in the psychosocial development. So thank you for having me on. I could definitely talk with you for a very long time, but I appreciate the work that you're doing. And thank you so much, and congratulations on your TED Talk.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening in today and for being here. I'm really, again, honored to have had Laura on the podcast. Remember that my protective parenting program really does help protective parents through a therapeutic lens when these kids are going between both homes or they're afraid to be with the abuser. That's why I created it. So again, thank you so much for being here. And that's it for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Perfect Prey, a Coercive Control podcast. You can find the show on my website at iknowyourheart.com or coercivecontrolconsulting.com, or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love your feedback, and I'm always looking for ideas on how to continue to expose coercive control as the significant harm and child abuse that it is. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Perfect Prey on Apple Podcasts. It helps others to find us. Perfect Prey is written by me, Dr. Christine Cocchiola, and with the help of my amazing team. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.